So welcome everyone to our latest in our series of knowledge mobilisation webinars delivered by the NHR. My name is Professor Lindsay Beirne and I'm a Senior Research Fellow in Knowledge Mobilisation at the NHR Evidence and Dissemination team. I'm co-hosting this webinar with Dr. Helen Baxter. Helen is a Research Fellow in Knowledge Mobilisation and Implementation at Art West. And we are really delighted to welcome Professor Annette Boas from the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene today. Annette is an international leader in promoting the use of evidence across a range of policy domains. She was part of one of the largest UK investments in the evidence use landscape. So that was the ERC Centre for Evidence-Based Policy and Practice, and was founding editor of the journal Evidence and Policy. In 2019, she published a new book, What Works Now, and this provides a detailed sector-by-sector analysis of evidence use in policy making and service delivery. And she also co-leads an international initiative called Transforming Evidence, which is designed to support the use of evidence in different policy fields and contexts. So Annette, we're really delighted to welcome you here today. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you so many of you for joining us today. As Lindsay said, I'm going to talk briefly to this topic of how we engage with policymakers, and then there's going to be plenty of time for questions, so please add your questions into the Q&A section. So I'm going to draw today on doing work in this area for more than 20 years, also the literature work others have done, and more recent experience as a knowledge mobiliser working in the UK government, and hopefully share some of that experience and learning with you today. So before we start, we'd like to run a couple of quick polls just to know who's in the room really, and I can use that to inform what I cover. So could you tell us how you describe your main role, whether as a practitioner, researcher, member of the public, knowledge mobilisation, funder, policymaker, or something else? And just give me a bit of an idea about whether you've got any experience of engaging with national policymakers. Okay, and we're going to close that poll now, if that's okay. So we're mainly researchers, but also some practitioners, some knowledge mobilisers, funders, policymakers, and 12% who are other, which I think reflects the fact that there's a lot of diversity in this area now, people with all sorts of different kind of roles, and that's really exciting. And a real mix in terms of sort of roughly half and half of people who have some experience and some who don't. That's really helpful for me for the rest of the webinar. Thank you. So what I'm going to cover off today is hopefully help us all understand a bit more what researchers can offer policymakers, to learn a bit about what the key areas are to consider when engaging with and sharing research knowledge with policymakers, to acknowledge and recognise some of the challenges, and hopefully give you some kind of very practical tips to take away and how we might overcome these challenges. So what do we know about this area already from the kind of existing literature and communities? We actually know that there are lots of different kind of areas where people are thinking about the use of research in policy and practice. These range from the knowledge mobilisation community that some of you will be part of, to the science policy studies community, to the growing world of implementation science, to evidence-based practice, and a kind of new area called meta-science. So lots of bodies of thinking about how we get research into policy and practice, all of which have something to say that we can learn from, but a bit of a daunting array of perspectives. And sometimes that can feel a bit paralysing when we try and learn about how to do this better. So Catherine Oliver and Paul Kearney did a review in this area asking what the existing academic literature tells us. And they had these 8 top tips, which I'm going to share with you now. The idea that what's really important about research as a source of knowledge is its quality. And so doing high quality research for policy is really critical. It's important to learn how to be a good communicator and communicating that research in a relevant and readable way. Understanding policy processes, contexts, and key actors, and that's something I'm going to return to. Being accessible to policymakers, so can you be found and are you willing to make time when policymakers are interested in talking to you? How do you feel about your role? So do you see yourself as a kind of advocate or an honest broker? What's your kind of feelings about how you engage with policy? Have you built relationships and ground rules with policymakers? So are you very clear about what you are and aren't prepared to do? Are you prepared to be a bit entrepreneurial? So are you prepared to kind of go out there with your research and push it pretty hard? And if not, are you prepared to find someone to do that for you? And have you made space to reflect and learn? So one of the things we find with kind of quite senior academics is that much of their learning about working with policy, they've gained on the job through their careers. But actually, there's opportunities for us to learn from that for people starting out as well. So I would say that we have come a long way, particularly in the UK, in our thinking about the use of research in policy. We started out with this very linear model that we pushed our research out there and just kept pushing as hard as possible. We used to do it by putting research papers in envelopes and sending them to people. Now we might do it by sending an email or posting our research on Twitter. It's that very kind of formal push of research out into policy. And that is still really important. It's really important that those bedrock resources are made available and distributed. But increasingly, we've recognized that also if we want research to be used in policy, there's some relational work that we need to do. We need to build those relationships and connections. We need to participate in networks, and we need to kind of make the relationships possible so that people can trust us to engage in policy discussions and deliberations. And then more recently, we've acknowledged that in addition to this relational working and pushing our research out, we also need to build much stronger systems to support research use. And we might think that actually some of the reward systems that we work within universities are not necessarily rewarding the kind of work that we might be doing with policymakers. So getting those reward systems right, the leadership right, and having the kind of right posts and infrastructure to support research use. And we have seen a really big growth in this area in the UK in recent years, particularly kind of posts within university, intermediary organisations like What Works centres, sort of giving us lots more scope to work in a more systemic way to promote the use of research. So that's all good. But I think we generally see that most of the literature, things that people have written up about doing this kind of work, and we did a mapping exercise looking at all kinds of initiatives that were supporting research use, that still a lot of it sits in that linear space about academic push of our research outwards into practice and policy, less in the relational and really less again in the systems space. So where we're kind of learning still sitting in that kind of linear area. And very little evaluation. So we do a lot, we write about a lot, but we aren't necessarily conducting rigorous evaluative studies to underpin that work. So a real challenge there that we build that learning in that was in Catherine and Paul's top tips. So what does it mean to be a really good knowledge mobiliser? And I just wanted to highlight some of the kind of personal traits I think that we can develop if we want to be good advocates for research. The first one is connectivity. So how good are we at making those connections between research and people who might use research? Sometimes this isn't our own research and we're advocating for the research of others. Sometimes it's just making that connection that so-and-so should meet another person, and just that connective and reflective thinking is absolutely what many knowledge mobilizers do, and we can also do as individual researchers. So connectivity, making those kind of connections in our own minds and helping people connect is a really important part of working in this space. Being creative, so seeing opportunities and grasping them. And sometimes that means getting out of our own comfort zone of attending kind of very academic meetings, but going and being part of other discussions, deliberations, things like design labs and opportunities for research to be one player within a wider discussion about a new policy idea or initiative. Being curious, and I think this is something that particularly kind of we're encouraged to do as academic researchers, but actually that curiosity about what's interesting and important, what's going on in the world, just such an important part of advocating for research is bringing that curiosity along with us on the journey. And perhaps most importantly, humility. I think often we have kind of gathered together in our area a substantial body of knowledge that we feel a great amount of confidence for and we want to advocate for. But we also need to demonstrate some humility about the experience that people have within their policy roles and actually what expertise they bring to the discussion, and being willing to always listen and think carefully about what others are saying as well as advocating for our research. So that humility feels like a kind of core component of being a really good mobilizer of the research we do for policy. And finally, this element of luck. We may have all these kind of great characteristics in our research, that really good quality research that we want to advocate for, but there's an awful lot of luck involved in the use of research in policy. This is Kingdon's framing around the kind of problem stream that we sit in as researchers, the policy stream and the political stream, and that these very seldom opportunities come where a window of opportunity opens where research can be kind of play an active role in policy discussions. And I would kind of emphasize that the rarity of these opportunities, and that's something that's quite hard to work with when we've got really great research that we want to advocate for. So we've recently completing a study where we're evaluating a set of research into policy initiatives. And one of the policy colleagues we spoke to said, if we'd spoken to 50 academics and they'd said, don't do this, unfortunately, I don't think it would have made any material difference to what we decided to do. And so that sense that even when we have this really important research we want to share, sometimes that window of opportunity is not open, and it's something that we kind of have to accept and move on and wait for maybe an opportunity to come further down the line. So something else I kind of wanted to raise was this issue about the fact that research, this sort of research we have to understand the use of research in policy, is maybe not as robust as we think it is. And in the paper I referenced earlier from Catherine Oliver and Paul Kenny, they conclude much of the advice is based on a misunderstanding about policy processes and the roles of researchers and policymakers. So actually, an awful lot of the ideas we take into our work rely on quite linear models, and they're very research-led. So they're about what we think we can do with our research. And actually, there's a bit of a challenge here in that we might not necessarily be working from the best base when we're trying to promote our research in policy. And there's a lot we could learn from areas like policy studies. One challenge that a colleague has kind of shared is around the idea of what it means to be a policymaker, for example. So it's really important that we think about our stakeholders, our policy stakeholders, when we're doing research. What he argues in this blog is that actually we need a much more nuanced understanding of the diverse roles that people have within the policy process. And not many people that I encounter in my work describe themselves as policymakers. And in fact, an awful lot of the work I do on research and policy, I'm engaging with analyst colleagues within government rather than people who are directly involved in kind of policy development roles. So that kind of understanding of who the people are and the different actors within the policy environment is really important. And we have tended to kind of group everybody together in this kind of big collective of a policy maker. But thinking about our stakeholders in a more systematic way can really help us with that. So to really map out at the start of a process who the stakeholders are we want to work with, and how much, this is the power and interest grid that's often used to map stakeholders, how much interest they have in the work we're doing, and how much power they have to change things, and to help us think about then how we then work with those stakeholders, and to revisit this during a project as our policy stakeholders often, as any of you who've worked with policy will know, move on to new roles, and we need to manage and create new relationships, and we may no longer be working with the same people we did at the start of a long research project. So thinking about who our stakeholders are, how we might work with them, and sort of starting to differentiate between different stakeholders can be really useful for policy. And often it's stakeholders that are on the outside of government who might help us advocate for our research in a particular context. So for example, within the voluntary sector, other areas that sit around policy where people have influencing roles and might be interested in using our research to change and to shape policy. So another thing I wanted to flag that also relates to this issue about maybe the evidence base we're using isn't always so robust. This is a study that's actually looked at what policymakers think are the barriers to research use. And many of our studies are asking academics what they think the barriers to research use by policymakers are. But this study looked at where actually the policymakers' barriers were. And what's really interesting about this piece of work is the relationships that I've already mentioned are so important, but also just how much of a barrier the values, ideologies, and beliefs of policymakers are to research use. So if your research isn't aligning with people's values, it's very unlikely for that research to make a difference to policy. And so trying to understand these barriers better from a policy perspective might help us think more carefully about how and differently about how our research might make a difference. Another element is understanding better the systems both in and out of government that are affecting how research is used. And this is a daunting tube map-like analogy with the science policy system in the UK. And it shows just how much is going on around a particular kind of research infrastructure within government and where we might connect into that. So the production of science advice is flowing through all kinds of different bits of government. Funding is flowing around that. And also within that, there are systems of accountability. And this is a map for government in the UK, but we might also have a similar one for local government. And we, of course, have our own systems within academia that have their own systems of kind of accountability, flows of funding, and issues around the production of evidence. Understanding and thinking about these systems can be really helpful for identifying kind of pressure points and opportunities for change that might make research more useful and usable going forward. So an example I wanted to share with you is the areas of research interest that Catherine Oliver and I have been working on in the UK government. And areas of research interest was an idea that came from Paul Nurse in the Nurse Review in 2015. And what he suggested was that all government departments should share and publish their areas of research interest so that those of us out in the research community had an idea what government was interested in terms of research, and that might help us in thinking about how our research might connect into government. And we've been working for the last 3 years to improve how those areas of research interest can act as a mechanism for academic policy engagement. And we're seeing all kinds of interesting ways people are using these. So they're using them to think about how research is funded, but also individual students and people doing fellowships have been using them to think about the priority areas for those fellowships. What we also find is they are useful for different government departments to connect together. So, for example, areas of interest that sit within transport often have parallels with education and things that are coming up in local government. And so that to see these through this transparent mechanism helps make some connections, and also that the areas of research interest connect into the department's science systems, and also, have that opportunity for something that academics can engage in with people in government departments to have kind of dialogue around those kind of shared interests. So this is just one tiny kind of mechanism, but there are lots of different elements that make up the government science system, and just having opportunities to kind of learn and reflect on these can be really useful. So what I wanted to share were a set of kind of take-home messages. The first of those is around having a plan. So I think if we're going to be thinking about our research influencing policy and having a kind of optimistic view on that, then it's really good to think about what you're trying to achieve and how you might go about it. And so just having that element of planning that some funders ask us to think about at the proposal stage, but we may by the exhausted end of a research project have kind of forgotten that we've actually put some thought into this already that we can re-engage with and think about what we're trying to achieve and how. I think that idea that comes from Catherine and Paul's review of having your own kind of rules of engagement is really important. So how do you feel comfortable in doing this kind of work? Where would you like to situate it? What do you not want to do? And how do you not want to be engaged? And who do you not want to engage with? So that you've thought through your own kind of personal rules of engagement for your work. I think it's really important to consider policy engagement as a team effort. So I think typically this is something that often very senior colleagues take on, but it's absolutely something that should be and can be of interest to everyone in a research team. And so that idea that everyone who's been involved in a project can have a role to play and to think of it collectively in a team can be really useful. So rather than it being an individual pursuit that feels that it's fallen upon us and something that people often describe as something they do in the evenings and weekends, to bring it as more integrated into the team and something we do together as part of a research project. But the key message in the literature is about really understanding who your stakeholders are. So that stakeholder mapping tool is one kind of device you might use, but just sitting down and thinking about who it is that's key to your work and asking others who they think is key to your work is really useful and helps us build that wider net of relationships that might then help us with our research to policy work. One of the other kind of things that's very popular at the moment is sort of making more opportunities available for people to understand better what the policy and practice worlds look like. So this is about kind of doing things like secondments or having opportunities to participate in government webinars and meetings, or lighter touch things like an opportunity to do a bit of shadowing. So having opportunities to see the other side of what somebody else's life and working environment's like. And so, for example, in the fellowships that we're currently undertaking, it's been really interesting to see the different style of meetings that government have, where often we're getting work done together in shorter, more focused meetings than the ones I'm used to in a university context. And that we very much do the work we do as a team all the time, and very little work is kind of done in isolation. So sort of just understanding the different constraints that are faced by people in different roles can be really helpful. And one of the things we're finding with some evaluation work we're doing is that how often it comes up that at some point in people's past, they've done some kind of fellowship opportunity or short-term placement, or done something like go and work at Post on doing one of their post notes. So lots of opportunities for people to move around the system. I think it's really important to appreciate what we can and can't do and what sits within our control and what doesn't. This can be a lot of effort and hard work for those opportunistic moments where you get to change things and you get to make a difference. So appreciating that and appreciating what's going to lie beyond your capacity and capability, I think makes this work feel less exhausting and draining. Going out expecting to change the world and then finding the work that you've done ended up left in the photocopier or ignored can feel demoralizing. So just recognizing the constraints around you and to have opportunities to reflect, learn and share on this work. And it's one of the things I think is so positive at the moment is we have these opportunities to learn together, and hopefully we can do that a bit today through the Q&A session. But we often do this work and sort of forget about it and work on the next project, rather than spending a little bit of time thinking what worked really well in this current piece of work. How have I built new relationships about and what helped me do that work? And so to have that kind of personal and team working learning is so important. And luckily, there are some great resources out there to support us in this work. There's a brilliant new resource produced by Nesta and the CAPE project on engaging with evidence. So that's freely available on the Nesta website. There are Post resources. So the Post has produced a how to write a policy brief piece of work, which is really useful. There's lots of stuff on the UPenn website, the University's Policy Engagement Network. There's meetings like the UK Knowledge Mobilisation Forum and all sorts of different kind of intermediary organisations. I've put here the Scottish Policy and Research Engagement Exchange Networks. I think that's a really interesting example in Scotland, but there are lots of these kind of intermediary what works kind of centres that cover all kinds of policy areas, full of very skilled people who understand how to get research into policy. And of course, there are the NIHR resources. There's lots of great stuff. And when I went to have a look, when I was preparing, I found this really interesting resource among many that was about helping researchers think about whether they wanted to see themselves as in a kind of inside track, taking a collaborative approach, or more of an outside track where they were doing more broadcast type approaches to promoting their research. So many great resources out there to use. And I'd really recommend going and having a kind of rifle through those when you've got a spare minute. So I wanted to just finish by acknowledging a few elephants in the room here. These are things that come up whenever we talk about research in policy. I think this question about whether academics should seek to influence policy, there are many academics who don't see that as part of their role, and I'm not sure it's something that is for everyone. But do we really think that researchers should be going out there and actively seeking to influence policy in their work? So just to recognise that that's an issue that comes up for debate and discussion. Another one is actually how we should do that. So how far would you go when you were trying to influence policy? How much are you prepared to kind of metaphorically get your hands dirty? how much are you prepared to engage with particular stakeholder constituents? And so this issue about, how should you actually go about it? What's the sort of approach that feels comfortable to you? And I would argue that that's a very personal thing about how you perceive the role of knowledge, how you think about policy, what the particular area you work in. So for some of us, the areas we work in are much more contentious and politicized, and for others, there are much closer and ongoing relationships between people in kind of political policy roles and people who are doing research. So this is very different depending on the sort of research you do. But it's sort of, these are questions that come up time and time again. And this issue about what you're actually trying to achieve. And I think there's a bit of an assumption sometimes that when we do this kind of work, we're trying to achieve kind of a substantial policy change based on the outcomes of our research. And that is so very rarely likely to happen, that actually what we're doing is engaging in a discussion and debate and being willing to discuss what our research means for policy, and how that is then used is often part of an onward journey that we don't even see the tail of as it goes off into kind of wider policy discussions within government. And so these are things we need to kind of think about and consider when we're doing work that has a kind of direct journey, hopefully, into some kind of use within the policy process. How comfortable are we with that, and how much have we thought about how we want to do that work and what we're trying to achieve? So I just wanted to finish by mentioning the work that Catherine Oliver and I are doing with Transforming Evidence. What we're trying to do is form a space to connect communities, to share expertise, and to think about where there are those research gaps I mentioned earlier. So we have all this work that goes on getting research into policy, but what are the kind of areas we need to learn more, and how do we know what's the best things to be doing? So we are connecting people across different disciplines, different geographies, also people working on very different areas of policy interest. And what we're interested in is sharing that knowledge, not reinventing the wheel, but kind of learning from what's been done before, so that we can hopefully make sure our research is the most useful it can be for policy deliberation and discussion. So we do this through our Transforming Evidence website. We have a kind of blog series with some great blogs in. I would definitely recommend reading some of those. We also have a Twitter feed, and we have a resources section full of kind of work that people are doing in this area. And if you have work you'd like to share with others, please send it to us and we can make sure it gets posted in that resources section. We also, Catherine and I both have our personal Twitter as well. So we try and share information that's coming up in this area through as many different ways as we can, to make sure that we can all do the very best we can to make sure that the significant investment in research in this country is as useful as possible for the people who might use it to bring about ultimately better services for people in this country. So I was going to finish there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Annette, for a really interesting presentation. We'll now open up the Q&A. There's still time for you to send in your questions by clicking on the Q&A button. You can send the questions to us anonymously and upvote on the ones that you want answered first by clicking on the thumb icon. So just to start off with, first question, Annette, with a limited resources and just me, what should I do? Where should I start?
I think a great sort of discipline is to start writing kind of blog posts based on our research that can be really accessible. It's a great discipline for getting your argument really tight, and they are kind of openly available for people to look at. So I think if I was going to do one thing, I would get better at writing blogs. There's people within our institutions now to support us much more than we've had in the past in kind of communicating our research. So that would be my one thing I would do. But we have really very little evidence about which of the strategies are most effective. And I think it's about having a kind of multi-strand approach if you have the resources to do it.
Next question. Is there a reason why research has to influence policy, whereas other sectors like oil and gas are allowed to lobby politicians directly? Does influencing have as much power as them?
That's a great question. And I think, people have written some really interesting, there's some work around kind of honest brokering, and actually someone's written a blog on our website about this, about how far we want to go with our research, how far we want to go into the area of kind of lobbying politicians directly. And some people do that with their research, and there's nothing to stop them doing that. And some we tend to use this language of influencing. And I think that does reflect more the reality of how research can really feed into people's discussions and deliberations around policy, and could be a much smoother process where actually we have opportunities to take part in exchanges where policymakers can ask us what things mean and ask us to explain and to discuss through and to help them think through different areas. So how comfortable many academics would be with a kind of more active lobbying role, I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Okay, this is from Ian. Is there a centralised resource to engage with policymakers when we set out on what we hope will be impactful research to ensure we enhance our research in the correct areas?
So that's a really good question. So, and one of the things that can be a bit overpowering for government departments is where they are kind of relentlessly bombarded by academics trying to get their research into policy. So I think it's a really good question, Ian, to think about, well, how do I do this in a way that enhances and also doesn't cause kind of lots of overload for policy colleagues? This is one of the things that we've argued with the areas of research interest, is that they can be this more centralized resource. So they're a connecting point. And so we are working at the moment, and which will be launched very soon, a kind of database, so an online system with all the government ARIs that will be searchable by people inside and outside government, so that we can see where our research connects in. And then government departments publish their areas of research interest as documents, and those will have a contact person on. So if you can see that connection, then it's possible to then get in touch and say, the research I'm doing does indeed connect with your interest. The other thing I would point to would be the What Works centres and other intermediary organisations. So the academies are another resource, who identify opportunities for research to be influential in areas they know are of policy interest, and do engagement activities and actually bring people together to talk around things. So in your kind of area of interest, kind of seeking out those more intermediary organizations, I think will be useful. And then the final thing I would say is kind of universities now have much more support for kind of knowledge into policy. And so, for example, I was talking to someone the other day who said in their university, the communications and knowledge mobilization staff had been in touch to say a select committee was coming up on her topic, and would she like to think about preparing something for that, and they could help with that. So I think the growing infrastructure in the UK means we're much better supported for our research to be useful, and not just a kind of overload of information for government, but tailored and coming in to be useful and supportive of people's needs.
Great, thank you. So this is a question from Becky. She said, I'm intrigued by the importance of research needing to align with policymakers' values and ideologies. What does that mean for something like public health in terms of speaking truth to power and pointing out the real harms that can arise to health and inequalities as a result of government policies?
Yeah, no, so yes, I probably should have been clear about this. So I don't think research needs to align at all with policymakers' values and ideologies. What the literature suggests is that if it doesn't, it's not that likely to be influential through that direct route. So it doesn't mean that we can't continue to speak truth to power and do the research that we think is important, particularly as our research is often informed by the priorities of people who are using services and in the community, and that's great. But I think it's just to be more cognizant that where there are these gaps between the values and ideologies of decision makers and our research, it's going to make it really difficult for that to get that research to be used. And so it's more of a contextual factor than something that would lead the type of research that we do and how we think that research, we might get that research. That window of opportunity is largely closed.
So a question from Sarah. Thinking about applying for research funding, if your research topic aligns to one of the published areas of research interest, is there a risk that this will change by the time the research is delivered? And what's the sort of longevity of this? What's the timeline?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we thought when we first started working on the areas of research interest, we did worry about this, but actually the areas of research interest are relatively consistent over time. So government departments tend to remain interested in kind of similar areas because they're facing similar and often quite intractable problems. So I think you'll find if you align your research with areas of research interest, There are some that are very specific to time that you would spot when you look at them, but most of them are kind of much more long-term concerns of government. So I wouldn't be unduly concerned about aligning with those areas of research interest and sort of flagging them, I think, to funders. We've been doing quite a lot of work with funders, and we see funders being interested in areas of research interest as a kind of way of them seeing the alignment of the research that comes into them with potential interest in government. So there will be some topics that are like that, but I think they will be fairly easy to spot and wouldn't necessarily be the areas you'd be doing your research in anyway. And then those things tend to get picked up by quite short-term bits of research that the department might commission out directly to meet a kind of immediate need.
Question from Conrad. How do we wear the political hats to reach and influence key decision makers? When we do our stakeholder mapping, how do we wear these different political hats?
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure what the question means there, really.
I think it's about policy advocacy meetings.
Yeah. I think it is quite difficult to think about. So some of these very influential stakeholders that we identified during our, say, power interest grid are not necessarily people that will come into contact with ourselves very much. So we're often thinking about some of those kind of alliances we might build with people who do have that kind of contact, who might advocate for our research on our behalf. And so particularly, as I mentioned earlier, I think some kind of smaller organizations, the voluntary sector, there are organizations that have really great access in terms of policy debate and discussion, aren't necessarily commissioning their own research and may be interested to be engaged in conversations with you about your research and how that might be useful to them. So I think they are particularly difficult, those kind of people at the top of the power interest grid, in terms of your access to them and whether you can get to walk in the worlds that they kind of walk in. But I think there are other routes to them. And they also often have people working for them who are in those kind of analyst roles that are reaching out and connecting with the academic community. And that's why I think much of the time, most of us don't have a lot of contact with politicians and even senior policymakers, but have some great relationships with analytical colleagues within government who are relatively stable within government compared to policy teams who move around quite a lot. And so building those relationships with an analyst who tend to have a really good understanding of kind of research and what research can contribute, have often quite high levels of research training, they can be really good allies for thinking about how your research can be useful for policy and really understand the policy context in which the research is landing.
So another question along those lines, someone who describes themselves more of a practitioner, one of the issues that they're having is that making sure the evidence and insights are considered of a high enough standard to be taken seriously by policymakers. And do you have any insights around providing policymakers with good research by their standards?
So that, yes. So I think this issue of research quality is a very, very important part of what we bring as those of us from the research community bring to policy. So there are all kinds of other forms of knowledge that are used within policy making, but what research brings are certain standards around quality, and a lot of that's about kind of transparency about how the work was done, independence and rigor, and those kind of generic standards around good quality research that we would recognize from within the community. The proxy for that, I think policymakers often take, is having built trusted and trusting relationships with individuals over time. And so that they kind of take those kind of relationships with somebody as kind of giving them a kind of way into quality. And so that, I think, is how sometimes that's played out in government. So they build relationships with people they trust and therefore then trust the research that they do, and perhaps the institutions in which they conduct it and the places in which they publish it. So I think quality is a really important part of this debate about research use, and it's what we're bringing to the table. And it is something that policymakers have quite a lot of support within their analytical functions and also within their scientific advisory committees to consider the quality of the research that they're being used and consider whether it's good enough. So I do think it is built into the infrastructure that quality matters, and there are systems and people in place to help make sure that that is the case. But those trusted relationships are really important too.
So a question from Claire here. Do you have any advice on sources of funding? It's sometimes hard to build engagement into research grants. Are there any separate funding resources that could be used to assist with this?
Yeah, so I think this is really difficult, isn't it? Because I think it's partly about funding, but it's also about time, that the time at which we are ready to be mobilizing our research for policy is often sometime after a grant has come to an end. And also there's that time throughout where we need to be thinking about knowledge mobilization. I mean, my general experience from funding panel perspectives is that nobody kind of looks at this kind of investment as not worthwhile. So if you build it into your existing funding applications, then it's something that funders look positively upon. They want researchers to be thinking about the use of the research they're investing in. So I think kind of, we all need to be a bit braver about kind of acknowledging the costs of this and building it into our research programs as a substantial kind of investment. In terms of additional bits of work, there are things like the impact accelerators that ESRC funds, but I think this is a really difficult thing. And I do see that there is an opportunity there for some funding that is just more focused on knowledge mobilization to support people who may not have thought at the start of a piece of work that it was going to be really potentially useful and have ended up with something that's really powerful. So you don't always know when you're planning a project that what you're going to generate. I mean, you rarely know actually what's going to come out at the end. And so actually having some funding opportunities in that space, I think, is really important. But we have teams within funders like NIHR and ESRC who are absolutely interested in this area. So much more so than when I first started working in this area sort of 15, 20 years ago. I mean, a real shift, a real acknowledgement of how important it is that the research that we've already had done can be as useful as possible. And also alongside that, more of a role for synthesis of the research we have already around kind of key policy topics.
And a little bit along those lines, coming from a slightly different perspective, someone would like to know your thoughts on how to reward policy engagement in research producing organisations rather than all this focus on measuring outputs. And the trouble is that often that the good work doesn't always result in immediate change. Things can happen much later on. And so it's very difficult for research organisations to almost get credit, isn't it, for that work that they're putting in that may not show up.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think we need to think creatively about how we reward work that's done in this area. So there's an international group of research funders who are looking specifically about how to change the incentives for academics, and the rewards that you get for doing this kind of work. So there's that big piece of work going on globally, which I think is really useful. I think within teams, we can recognize it so as kind of managers. We can make sure that it's something that we recognize and acknowledge and support in our teams. I think that's really important. I know universities which have been building it much more explicitly into their recruitment and performance review and promotion criteria, so that to raise this up to have a much more of a status. And the other thing I would flag is I really think things like the ESRC's Impact Prize. In Ireland, they also have an Impact Prize, and in Australia, they've been running Impact Prize. So just really nice ways to celebrate the incredible work that some people do to make sure that their research is useful and used, and the incredible investment of their own personal time as well as their professional time. So I think there are a number of things we can do to really make sure this work is truly valued. And we've got a long way to go, because I think we're still pretty constrained by this idea that what matters for academic researchers is that they publish and gain grants and have PhD completions, and that we have a bit more to go to build this into that kind of core of people's identity.
And along those lines, Jessica has asked, do you have any good examples of where research has influenced policy successfully, and perhaps where it hasn't been so successful?
Yes, I would definitely recommend going and having a look on the ESRC's websites at the recipients of their Impact Prize. So it's been running for a number of years now, and they've got little case study videos of people's impact, and they're across all kinds of areas. So they range from, so there are some about anthropologists influencing global pandemic response through things like Ebola. There's a really interesting piece of work there. And there's another one about the work that went on from the political science community to support the referendums and electoral reform in Scotland. So there are some just great examples, and the way that they organise it is there are individual awards, and then there's an institution award, and there's an earlier career award, and so there are different stages, and so there are different types of impact that people are achieving and in different policy areas. So I think that's a really good compendium of influence. In terms of things that are less successful, I think that's more of the norm of our experience, actually, that, you know, it's actually really difficult to influence policy. And sometimes we might go down different avenues, like, you know, directly engaging with trying to influence practice, for example, or kind of, you know, organizations that are there to influence practice, like through clinical guidance and other types of guidance. So I think there are ways around if you're not going to find it that easy to influence policy as well, because I think there's more examples of it being difficult than people having really shiny successes.
So a question from Paula, which has just disappeared off the top of my screen somehow. Thinking about influencing policymakers to implement the findings of methodological research rather than particular health and healthcare issues. Do you see different issues, barriers, or facilitators? So presumably the policymakers are going to be different, but are the difficulties different?
That's a great question, Paula. And I think that one of the downsides of our push towards, which has really been important to, you know, making sure research makes a difference for people receiving healthcare services, is that there's a danger we lose sight of some of these important building blocks in the research landscape. And so there's always been a strong call in the evidence use kind of community not to forget the role of things like methodological research, blue skies research, you know, inquiry-led topics, because they are just as important in that kind of landscape of the types of research we need to build really good quality studies for the future. But I do think the drive has presented some problems for that work, because it is quite upstream a lot of the time. And so my way of dealing with that would be to acknowledge that when writing around impact in this work, and to make the case for its contribution really explicitly, because otherwise I think that there's a danger that's got a little bit lost. But yeah, really good question.
Great. So a question from Mandy. What advice would you give to a researcher trying to influence quite a contentious policy area like universal credit, so it better meets the needs of claimants in what feels like a bit of a toxic and unreceptive political environment?
We were having a conversation about this around another policy area the other day, around what you do when your research is in a particularly difficult, contentious area. And this is really another big challenge, you know. So it's hard enough to get your research to influence policy in an area where there are these really good long-term relationships around the kind of problem solving for the challenges we're facing. But it is so much more difficult for topics like this. And I think it just involves a lot more work with a lot more stakeholders, and also a recognition of maybe of how difficult it's going to be to really achieve traction and change. What I would say, though, is, and this relates, I think, to a point Conrad put in the chat earlier, which was about how do you know when luck is around the corner? And I think generally you don't know that luck is around the corner. So being ready for those windows of opportunity when they open up, that they aren't necessarily very visible, but they do come along, and you do get kind of dramatic changes in terms of leadership, for example. So we know some politicians are much more interested in research than others, for example. You know, so changes in that kind of landscape and infrastructure can suddenly shunt and change things and give us opportunities that we didn't think were going to come along. What I think is quite difficult for us is having that kind of readiness to take those opportunities when they come, because we have our own kind of pressures and demands, and we've often moved on to the next project. So to be ready and be advocates for those previous things that we did when those opportunities come along, I think that's the critical thing, is that kind of readiness, and also particularly with these kind of more challenging elements that you don't necessarily think you're going to get an opportunity, but you have to kind of keep your energy high for if those do come along, because they are areas like universal credit that really matter. So you want to be able to make a difference when you get those opportunities.
So a little bit along those lines, Peter would like to know, is there anything a researcher can do to create or bring forward a window of opportunity? Or are we very much at the mercy of things as they are?
I would say we are not in the window construction business.
Okay.
we are way from that. So and unfortunately, I mean, sometimes you do move around the system and find that it's one of the things when I was sharing the stakeholder grid, that people move around the stakeholder grid all the time. And so you may find that you are, through your own movement in your career, suddenly in a position to create opportunities, or have suddenly access to people who are in those kind of positions. So I think it can happen, but that would be the rarity. And that most of the time we're a little bit of a victim to those policy and political strands, which are kind of driving the opportunities.
Great, thank you. Another question here, how do you address the bias in research if that research is intended to influence policy?
That's a great question. We could spend a whole hour talking about that. So, I mean, I think this is the areas where dialogue is so important, so opportunities to sit down with people who are using research within decision-making contexts, and to have that nuanced conversation about the biases that sit within certain bits of work, and to kind of help them understand what the contributions of different perspectives are. I think it's why syntheses of many studies are really important, so that show that what a body of knowledge says rather than individual studies. And we would argue that obviously on a general basis, we talk about the importance of synthesis, but I think there's a big argument to be made there about the real value that brings for policy making as well, of knowing what a body of knowledge says around a topic, and those nuanced differences in terms of things like biases and the kind of age of the research and the different perspectives in which people have conducted research. So I think those are important things there, that space to discuss and talk about the nuances behind the conclusions of certain studies, but also to pull the body of knowledge together.
That's great, thank you. Well, we've answered 25 questions, but we've got another 70 to go, Annette. So I think we'd better stop there. And I'm sorry if I haven't managed to ask your question, but we will do our very best to follow up with you and answer any others. I've tried to mix them up a bit, so I'm sorry if I've missed you out. Thanks so much again, Annette. I'm sure everyone's found this webinar very beneficial. We're obviously lots of enthusiasm, and I hope everyone feels able to apply some of these techniques in their own research. As we mentioned at the start of the webinar, for those of you joining us live, as you close the session, you'll be asked to complete a quick evaluation form, and the link is now also available in the chat. We wanted you to know that we will be organising further webinars on mobilising knowledge with other key audiences, such as with members of the public. So do look out for these in the NIHR Evidence newsletter, or follow us on Twitter at NIHR Evidence. All our past webinars can be found on NIHR TV YouTube channel, and do check out the summaries of the NIHR research on the Evidence website. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you again, Annette, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.